he seems to talk, or at least the message I got was a bit more about addressing the ideas of metta or karuna. And this discourse doesn't seem to talk so much about compassion and love. Yeah. And I'm wondering why it does have this kind of dark feeling and not teaching us about how one should approach these attachments.
Yeah. Okay, first, let me just summarize the discourse that you have in mind. If it's the same one that I have in mind, it doesn't actually bring in metta and karuna. But tell me if this is the one. It occurs in the Udana, a little word called the Udana. The Buddha has a lay woman disciple, her name is Visakha, and she comes to the Buddha during the day, again with wearing the distinctive funeral clothes with the wet hair. And then the Buddha says, "Why are you coming here in the middle of the day with your hair wet?" It seems that was a symbol somehow of grieving. And then she says, "My granddaughter, dear and beloved, has died." And then the Buddha says, "Would you like to have as many grandchildren as there are children in this city of Savatthi?" And she says, "Oh yes, I would like to have like 1,000 grandchildren." And then the Buddha says, "If you had 1,000 grandchildren, then each time one of them died, you would be grieving." Is that the one that you have in mind? Yeah. Yeah. So here again, and then the verses sort of emphasize the point. The verses that go with that sutta say that for one who has 1,000 dear ones, there's 1,000 sorrows. For one who has 100 dear ones, there are 100 sorrows. For one who has 10 dear ones, there are 10 sorrows. For one who has no dear ones, there is no sorrow. But I think the point that you make is true, that there's a distinction, or we should actually say that this is the case, and this agrees well with the point that Michael made about attachment underlying this endearment, that there's a distinction between metta, which is, we call it universal love or loving kindness, and prema. Prema is affection. The affection usually with the sense that there's some kind of a personal attachment underlying it. But then should the message be that everybody should give up all personal affection immediately? That seems pretty strong.
I'm just reminded by a story I heard, or what I heard, that Queen Elizabeth said after September 11th, and I'm just going to paraphrase, but something to the effect of, like, grief is the price we pay for love. Mm-hmm. And just to echo what else has been said, perhaps that there's a bit of a transaction that occurs around it, almost, that we can, that we have, perhaps we can accept the price of it. It doesn't mean that it's necessarily the only thing that we experience, that there could be a range. Maybe that's a little bit what I get from this.
Yeah. Okay, Katie wants to. Wait, take the microphone.
I think you asked, that seems, or you mentioned it seems a bit extreme to not have relative affection. I just think that there's certain gratifications that are completely natural to a social species, the human brain, I can say.
Yeah.
And so to see someone familiar to me that is also a friend and I have lots of good memories with, just to see them, to unexpectedly see them, it's completely natural for the brain to experience a surge and maybe delta phos B, whatever.
Yeah.
It's unnatural to refute a little affection.
Yeah.
But if it's understood in this bath of a nature of things, I think so there's that is just calming the natural reaction of the brain. And then there's the second part of taking care of one's local family and that can also involve, it doesn't mean, yes, abandon affections and parents immediately.
Yeah, that's exactly the point that I would have wanted to make. Even when we read the suttas, extensively, we see that between certain of the monks who are arahats, there are like certain bonds of natural affection, like Sariputta and Ananda. Sariputta and Moggallana were very good friends, and you don't see Sariputta sort of palling around with some of the other monks, maybe like Mahakachana. You hardly ever see them mentioned in the same sutta. But often Moggallana and Sariputta are together. I think Anuruddha and Mahakassapa have Mahakassapa is a little of a fierce type, the hard loner type, but they seem to get along pretty well together. So there seem to be natural ties of affection between certain people based upon, sometimes it can be psychological complementarity, where their characters complement one another. In certain cases it can be a kind of a natural sympathy or empathy because of similarities in their character. But I think the essential point is that the relationship should be embedded within a realization of, through wisdom or understanding. This is adequately, nicely expressed in a formula that the Buddha teaches, that all of his disciples, he says, whether they are renunciants, monastics, or lay people, should often reflect on this. And it's a statement, Sabbehi me piyehi manapehi nana bhavo vina bhavoti, that from all who are dear and agreeable to myself, there must be parting and separation. So if one has a clear understanding that inevitably at some point there's going to be separation from everyone that I love and have affection for, then one can have a close relationship with them based upon love and affection. But that relationship, to the extent that one understands this, will not be dominated by this attachment and clinging. So we could say that there is a natural, wholesome, healthy type of love and affection, but very often what becomes parasitic on that love and affection is the clinging and the attachment. So I think the point of this sutta is, not to allow that clinging and attachment to develop on the basis of that natural love and affection. If we look at, again, I have to say, like a wide range of suttas, not just the direct discourses of the Buddha, but those suttas that have narrative portions, we see how relationships develop. And even when, after Sariputta and Moggallana passed away, this is in Satipatthana Samyutta, it's chapter 47 in the Samyutta Nikaya. It could be sutta number 12, 13, 14, somewhere around there. The Buddha is looking out over the assembly of monks, and then he says, now that Sariputta and Moggallana have passed away, this assembly appears to me to be empty. Very strong words. He uses the word sunyo, like sunyata, but not in the philosophical sense. But he says that it's just as though there were a big tree with a great trunk, and it had two big branches, and one passes that tree, regularly, on and off, one passes the tree, and one is always acquainted with the image of this big tree with its two big branches. Then suddenly, one day, the two big branches collapse, and one passes by the tree again, and one notices at once that, the tree is just not its old self anymore. The two big branches that gave that tree its distinctive character have collapsed. And so the tree now seems as though it's been reduced to about half of or a quarter of its original size. And so the Buddha is saying that, so when I look out at this assembly of monks, it seems to be empty. But then he goes on to say, but even so, there is no sorrow, grief, lamentation, pain, and despair in the Tathagata. Okay, Claudia wants to say something.
Claudia.
Please.
Yeah, it's working, right? Yeah, a few reactions to it. The term that he used of, where was it? Deranged. It's a translation, so I don't know how close it is, but it seems to me to be quite judgmental, which is a surprise.
Let me just take a look. I think here, that would be the choice of the translator. I think here I modified Venerable Nyanamoli's original translation. Let me just see if I could recollect the original Pali word. I think the original word means something, if I remember, it's anyatatang, something like that has undergone some change of state.
That's
so
much more accurate than deranged.
Yeah, okay, maybe deranged was a somewhat strong choice on my part.
Yeah, change of state is exactly the word I would use to the phrase. Yeah, thank you. I'm also surprised here that it's a conversation. There's so much emphasis on direct experience. And I'm thinking of, like this other sutta you were talking about with the woman with the wet hair, or of the story about the, the seed, someone's supposed to go around and find a home that hasn't been affected.
Yeah.
But this is conversational, and as opposed to having a sutta where the king directly experiences the loss.
Yeah, well, this is setting up like a hypothetical situations. You mean the king's conversation with the queen? Yeah, because here Mallika is trying to convince the king of the truth of the Buddha's words, and probably the king is quite secure now. He hasn't really undergone any kind of major loss in his life at this point. Of course, I think since he's king, he would have lost his father, because as long as his father was alive, he would have just been the prince, not yet a king. But maybe he just took it in stride because his father was old. There was one thing I wanted to point out, that often within traditional Buddhist circles, like in traditional Buddhist countries, because of suttas like this and statements like this, there's a feeling amongst people that I would consider to be somewhat of an unwholesome feeling, that if somebody loses a beloved, like a woman loses her husband, the husband loses his wife, the parents lose a child, then naturally they'll feel sorrow and grief, and then they blame themselves that, oh, I'm imperfect, this is my shortcoming, this is a fault of mine, I'm so straddled with these defilements that I break out in sorrow. But what I tell people who have lost loved ones, or who are imagining a situation where they would lose a loved one who's close to them, what I would say is, let oneself feel that grief and sorrow. Let it work through the system. That's just the natural feeling that happens when one loses a loved one. One has to take it that maybe one is not yet a fully liberated arahat. So it's quite natural to feel that kind of sorrow and grief, but also balance that sorrow and grief with the recognition that there must be parting and separation from all who are dear and beloved. So if one has that understanding, then one can, just let that sorrow and grief work naturally through the system, and then after a short period of time, it does by short, I don't mean 1 or 2 days, but a couple of weeks, a month or so, one readjusts to one's life without the loved person, and one can, get on with one's day-to-day life. One can start to work, to work again. One will resume one's ordinary activities. Over some time, one might start to develop other relationships. And so one will cherish the memory of the loved one. It doesn't mean that one forgets about them completely, but one recognizes that this is the nature of life, and so one can't be, always tied down by memories of the loved one who has passed away. Just to give an example of this that just came to my mind yesterday. Maybe some of you know Tsuku Lee, who's in charge here of the book distribution program. He's lived at Zhuangyan Monastery for probably almost the time that the monastery was established. Earlier this week, his mother passed away. His mother was 103 years old. She had been born, it must have been China in the year 1909, probably the last years. Is this the Qing dynasty? The last years of the Qing dynasty. When she was growing up as a little girl, her elders bound her feet. This was a custom in old China. They consider girls to be beautiful and women to be beautiful and feminine when they have small feet. So the elders would bind the feet so that when the girl grows up, she has these very small, delicate feet. She lived through, the birth of the Chinese Republic, then the 1930s, the Japanese occupation, World War II in mainland China, then the Communist Revolution in 1948-49. Then from China, she had to flee to Taiwan, probably, 49 or 50. Then after her children became established in the U.S., she moved to the U.S., and she continued to live on Long Island for many years. I think she came 1974, they said at the funeral, if I remember. Until just a few days ago. So she passes away at the age of 103, and then her children and one grandchild were giving talks, we call these appreciation talks at the funeral. And the grandson and 2 of her sons, as they were speaking, they would be weeping. And even one of the sons was weeping so much that almost that he couldn't continue to speak. And so the other relatives had to tell him, just sit down. But when Tsuku came to speak, he was quite calm, which to my mind, it doesn't mean that he didn't love his mother, but because he's well-grounded in Buddhist understanding, so he knows that, everyone has to pass away. And like when my teacher, Venerable Nyanaponika, passed away, I lived with him for 10.5 years in the Forest Hermitage in Kandy. This was an elder German monk who was living in Sri Lanka since 1936. He's the author of some very important books in English on Buddhism, especially The Heart of Buddhist Meditation. He passed away. I came to live with him in 1984. I lived with him up to the time of his death, 1994. He was 93 years old at the time of his death. So I felt really moved at the time of his death, but it didn't cause me to feel, grief, misery, or sorrow. Because I know he's 93 years old and he had been blind for the last about 4 years, 3 or 4 years. And so just accepted the fact that he passes away. And so there comes a kind of feeling of being moved as I recollect our close relationship, our spiritual friendship. But I wasn't lamenting why have you gone so soon? Why don't you stay around a few more years? But there's another woman in Sri Lanka that I know. She was the typesetter for the Buddhist Publication Society in the 1990s. And she lost her husband about a year, was it a year ago? About a few months ago? Yeah, a few months ago. And she should know better because she's typed all of the books on Buddhism for years and years. She lost her husband, and then she wrote to me a couple of weeks ago that now her life feels so empty, she feels so miserable, and she's sure that her husband is going to come back, and she's just waiting for him to come back, you know, expecting her husband to come back. I wrote back to her that even if he's born as a little baby right next to her, how is she going to know that this is her husband who's come back? And by the time her husband gets to be 20 years old, you know, she might be 60, she'll be 80 years old now. So what relationship could there be between a young man of 20 and now an old woman of 80? Okay, so I think this is the message of the sutta. Richard, you have something to add? Please take the microphone.
This looks to me like advice for detachment, and that kind of troubles me for this reason.
Advice for what?
Detachment.
Yeah.
I don't know. Is this on?
It's on.
Yeah. It looks like you're saying, okay, the contrast here is between the Buddha saying that, you know, the source of sorrow and so on is one who is dear, and the gamblers and the the original speaker saying, well, this is a source of joy and such. But there's also a question of knowledge. That is, if you're detached from people, you really don't know them. There's a whole lot you don't know. I mean, I think of my family, and if I follow events that happen to my kids and my wife every day, and so on, and that's our lives. And if I were detached from them, I really wouldn't understand them. That is, I wouldn't know them. You know them because of all the things that you share. That is, there's something in a relationship that is understandable in no other way. You don't, when you just run into somebody, you don't know what's going on inside of them because people don't give continuous evidence of what life is to them. It develops over time, and it's a creature of time. And without attachment to people, there's no real knowledge of people. And this is what, you see, both of these things are true. Sorrow and lamentation are born from those who were dear, and also joy and happiness are born from those who were dear. And it looks like, there's the one is supposed to be true and the other not true, but they're both true.
That's a good point. Now, Katie has some... Just when you were speaking, she raised her hand, so I think she has some comment on that.
Well, I did want to say, I think this is, and I'm not the only one to say it, that one of the big misunderstandings of Buddhism is not detaching from others, it's detaching from oneself. That's a dissociative disorder, to detach from others and to become cool to them. And I think people do encounter that through the meditative process over years. They may go through, there may be a stage of cool dissociation. But detachment, when people, there's like a society for good listening, I forget what it's called.
The Society for?
Listening, good listening skills, so that diplomats and people can detach from themselves the desire to cure another person, the desire to fix another person, the desire to not hear, detaching from aversion, detaching from strong love. It's not detaching from the family member. And this is that transformative moment that allows for a transcendent moment to say, I can actually now see that person better than I saw them before because I've shut up. I'm not suppressing anything. That comes in the work of meditation, to hear what one's own thoughts are, but to come to the table and try to detach from, to not be so moved by one's own emotional state that there can be hearing of the other.
Okay, I think that there are a lot of good points to continue the discussion with. Why don't we sort of adjourn for the lunch break? And then we'll come back at, let's say, 10 after 12 or so, and then we could continue to discuss this after lunch. So please do come back. Okay, Johnny is getting the sharing of the merits. And I should mention that next Saturday we won't have the class because there's a meditation course here. It's an 8-day course in the Brahmaviharas, in loving kindness and compassion, which I think we also have to bring into this discussion, you know, as balances to this kind of detachment that's being advocated here. So next Saturday we won't have the class, but I think the meditation course continues to the following Saturday, but that Saturday we'll have the class. If the meditation course is on here in this room, then we'll have the class in the library, because I don't want to cancel 2 classes. And if you're interested if you have the time and interest to attend the retreat, you could either register for it online at the website, the Buddhist Association of the United States, or you can go to the office and speak to somebody in the office. This will be the meditation retreat on what they call the divine abodes or sublime abodes, loving kindness, compassion, altruistic joy, and equanimity. Oh, there's a question here from the internet. Let me just see. Seems that the attachment described contains 2 roots. Isn't there clinging in both of these, even though this moves between being underlain by greed and aversion? I guess he means that there's greed in clinging to the person and then aversion towards the loss of the person. Yeah, that seems to be the case. Yeah. Okay, so let us end with the sharing of the merits. We share the merits from the meditation session, the speaking on Dhamma, listening on Dhamma, discussing the Dhamma. We share the merits with the devas, the deities that protect the Dhamma, with the fierce spirits, the Buddhas, the Nagas, and all beings, wishing them to be well and happy and achieve their good purposes. Akasata chabumata deva naga mahitika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu sasanang. Akasata chabumata deva naga mahitika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu desanang. Akasata chabumata deva naga mahitika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu mang parang. Etavata cha amhehi sampadang punya sampadang sabbe devanumodantu sabba sampati siddhya. Etavata cha amhehi dang punya sampadang sabbe bhutanumodantu sabba sampati siddhya. Etavata cha amhehi sampadang punya sampadang sabbe satanumodantu sabba sampati siddhya. Bhavagupadaya vichihetato etantare satakayupapanna rupya rupicha sanya sanyino dukkha pamuchantu pusantu nibbutting. Okay, we stand and then we do 3 half bows to Buddha.